It's a great honor to be here, and I would like to thank the New Indian Express for giving this opportunity. It's already been introduced. There's a book about the youth, or the youth in us. In a way, this session is going into a new area that is non-fiction, a particular kind of non-fiction, narrative non-fiction, that we'll be talking more about. He is better known so far, because this book just came out, for his collection of short stories, Eunuch Park, which was very widely reviewed and with much critical acclaim as breaking new ground in fiction. Palash, maybe you could tell us a bit. I mean, of course, the blurb says it is part memoir, part travelogue, part commentary, and it's a book about what the publisher calls it the new India from an insider's perspective. So could you just tell us a bit about this butterfly generation?
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Why did I call it the butterfly generation, right? Butterfly for 3 or 4 very simple reasons. One, it's a deeply bilingual generation. And when I say bilingual, it doesn't just mean the ability to speak in 2 languages. It's the ability to move from one thing to another, to flit from one thing to another, so to speak. As Indians, we can do things, say, which a European or an American might find it difficult to do. For example, when we're watching movies, we switch between an American channel like HBO to a regional channel or Zee Cinema or to a Bollywood film. An Indian girl can feel comfortable in a sari or a little black dress. So it's this ability to move from one thing to another. So I suppose that was one thing that's why I called it the butterfly generation. Also metamorphosis, metamorphosis because this generation has undergone a lot of change from the 1980s socialist India in which we grew up in. Drinking Campa Cola, and my father had to wait for 5 years to get his Bajaj Chetak scooter. We didn't have phones. It was difficult to get a phone connection. So my generation remembers that time. It's a kind of cusp generation, and we've gone through a lot of change. So butterfly also was a metaphor for this change. From that time, from the 80s India that we grew up in, the socialist India then, and the capitalist India that we live in today.
But this butterfly generation that you're talking about, our generation, is it about the urban middle class youth particularly that you're talking about, or is it about the rural youth also?
It's a big country, and it's a very vast society. When you talk about the young in India, you can talk about the young in Allahabad, you can talk about the young in Bombay, you can talk about... So, I've narrowed it down to urban youth, partly also because I've grown up in small towns. And before I wrote, when I set out to research the butterfly generation, I was living in Dehradun for 7 years, and I grew up in Allahabad. So, for me, just the kids in Bombay, Bangalore, and Delhi, what they were doing was quite fresh. Within urban youth, I've narrowed it down to 3 cities because for various reasons. And these are English-speaking, westernized kids. And 3 cities because you can't put everything into a book. The publisher says there's 80,000 words. I can't write 200,000 words. So you have to narrow things down. The dedication to this book is to our parents who kept it together. So I think parents are very crucial to this generation because they kind of laid the foundation which allowed this generation to play around, do things, and there was already a foundation of a liberal foundation, on which we could build and play.
One short question.
Yeah.
I quite connect to you talking about we growing up in the socialist 80s. I remember when I passed school in 93 and MTV arrived. Now, I was not part of that crowd which was into MTV.
Right.
And I suddenly felt that, with my juniors who were maybe 2 years junior to me, I felt there was a generation gap. It hit me suddenly when I was just out of school. Did you have any such experience, or did you feel anything like that?
We grew up with one television channel, Doordarshan, and that was all we had. And now, we have access to 100 channels. So I think, these were simple things that we now take for granted, and we forget that how different things were. We didn't have access. There was no broadband. You wanted to read something, say the London Review of Books. You didn't know how to access that. This generation felt very strongly the change.
So would you like to read out something?
Sure.
Proceed with the conversation.
Yeah. This is about listening to music and television in the 1980s and 90s. In the 1980s and early 1990s, when it came to programming, The young were often overlooked. I'm talking about Doordarshan here, which was the only channel. Our first glimmer of hope came when Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister. After all, he wore lotto shoes when campaigning. He was wearing them when he was assassinated, flew aeroplanes, and had a sexy Italian for a wife. In the hot and dusty world of Indian politics, he was the beacon of cool. And clad in a traditional Indian sari with flowers in her hair and tinkling glass bangles on the wrist, Uthup cut quite a figure, a fascinating, if rather obvious symbol of Indian bilingualism, of a country poised on the cusp of radical economic change, of a society that wanted to leapfrog into the future without letting go of its past. Pop time was significant insofar it was the first time young India, especially the urban young, was acknowledged as an independent grouping. The show was launched at Rajiv's suggestion. Elections were round the corner and he wanted to woo the urban young. There was Vijay Sophia, a sultry, slender beauty who hosted the show Alternative Nation. She too had a band, Akasa, and one Pan-Asian hit to her name, One Night in My Life. There was the childlike Noni who hosted the popular request show MTV's Most Wanted, and the blander-than-bottle-girl Vijay Trey, who was a success with the pre-teens. Now, why in the world would a guy in India have sideburns? I have sideburns because I watch MTV. For years, we had been fed public service announcements about national integration. Ek Chidiya, the greatness of India, Mera Bharat Mahan, and the benefits of contraception, Matki Phoot Gayi, Radha Toot Gayi. But we had never seen an ad spot like the one advocating sideburns. It involved and implicated us, poked gentle fun at us, and acknowledged an adolescent phenomenon that had quickly spread across the country. Thousands of kids, including me, had dropped their sideburns under Danny McGill's influence. To understand the full impact of the spot, its odd significance, keep in mind that 2 decades ago we were a society where the young had no voice and the family elders held the puppet strings. Urban India was still some years away from recognizing that its young men and women would be the drivers of the new economy, both as a workforce and as a consumer base. This happened post-economic liberalization, when the young was seen to have purchasing power and as constituting an important market for mobile phones, laptops, clothes, shoes, sunglasses, bikes, and watches. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
I mean, just correct me if I'm wrong. You know, the way the book has been projected, and you mentioned that, about the new India, or about even the youth. Like, the blurb begins by saying, you know, half of India's population is under 25.
Yeah.
But is it so much about the youth, or is it about actually people like us? Because like Pinaz Masani, I don't know how many young people now would connect to Pinaz Masani or many of these things.
Well, you know, I've had 2 experiences with this. You know, I mean, a lot of younger people who weren't around when all this happened want to know about this, you know, what happened to the generation before them. But it's really about people like us, you know, people in their 30s who as I said, remember the 80s, and those who don't want to know about it, you know, because they kind of grew up in a time when they took VH1 and broadband and downloading music for granted.
Between then and now, though a lot of parents still don't give that liberty to the children, but I think now, could you speak a bit more about this freedom?
You know, I think what's happening is, I mean, as you're saying that a lot of parents might not give this liberty to their children, but the thing is that our cities are there, and you can live an anonymous life in our cities, and there are more and more young people who just leave for the city when they can, because, well, there are jobs for younger people, and there are more jobs which you can do at an earlier age, which means you don't really need to be dependent on your parents if you don't get along with them. I mean, you know, and I think a lot of these kids have, say, moved into Delhi. I mean, these are people I meet all the time, and at some point the parents come around to what you're doing. Like, I met this dancer, she's also there in the book, she becomes a belly dancer, and
these are very nice. Didn't know that.
Her father didn't know it, you know, but she really couldn't be bothered, because she would say that, you know, he'd shoot me if he found out, but there was no way he was going to find out, and she was making enough money to rent an apartment with friends and lead an independent life. So I think, you know, all that's happening, and I think those who want to pretend that this is only the elite, I think you're turning a blind eye to what is a revolution within the middle class. So when you're talking about the middle class in a few big cities, you're already talking about a few million people, and you can't dismiss outright what a few million people are doing.
You know, one of the things I found very interesting in your book, in The Butterfly Generation, is your discussion about the English-speaking working class.
There's something about the English-speaking working class, what I call the English-speaking working class, which is, look, I mean, Indian middle class, you know, if you speak English or you spoke English, you didn't do manual / menial jobs, you know, you didn't use your hands, you would prefer a desk job, but you wouldn't even clean your own car. This was something that struck me in a small town when I was in Dehradun. You know, when I went to Cafe Coffee Day or to Pizza Hut or to McDonald's, these kids who worked there, who were grinding the coffee beans and kneading the dough and making pizza for you, they're all talking to each other in English, you know, and that seemed like a big change, and they were cracking jokes about Madonna, and you know, and then I got talking to them, and then I just realized they're just people like us, which was not the case earlier, where there was a divide between the person with the money and the person who did the serving and the person who did the actual making of, you know. So I think, you know, that is something about the English-speaking working class, which I think is a big change, that respect for labor that we have now to some extent. I have known of musicians who've taken up jobs in call centers just because they want to buy their guitar or their drum kit, you know, and so they work for a period of time, and then they have the money to buy what they want, and then they quit. Now, this sort of independence cannot be a bad thing, you know. So you can kind of expect everyone to wallow in poverty and then kind of dismiss when they try to lift themselves out of it, say, oh, they're cyber coolies. But, you know, having a job is better than having no job at all.
But, you know, talking about the working class again, I find another chapter in your book very interesting.
Right.
Though I'm not sure how it fits in with the rest.
Yeah.
And your perception that the new food regulations, instead of making the food more hygienic for us, is actually going to affect the street vendor more.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the hawkers thing is just a column I wrote. No, I mean, obviously, you know, any sensible person will feel for the small person, and, you know, but, you know, Servants of India did fit into the book in my head. I'll tell you how. It's about, you know, because a lot of young people who are in their 30s, you say young couples, they have servants, right? And these people are also part of the book. So they come in touch with these servants, and these servants often are young people, you know. So there's a chapter in this book about an auto rickshaw driver in Dehradun, you know, because he's also a young person, and you know, that again, he comes in touch with these posh kids and his interactions with them, you know, and how he's on the ladder up. So I think the other side is important, because I mean, people in India coexist, you know, so the servants are also living in the same house.
But given these interests in your book, I find it a little surprising,
right,
that you don't really seem to talk about change, a kind of social change in your book. The only change you seem to be celebrating is a kind of, or the revolution that you seem to be celebrating is a kind of sexual revolution.
Drug revolution as well, yeah. No, it's true, yeah.
But I see a lot of young people now wanting to, you know, experiment with their lives and do work for change or whatever. Or do you think that our generation was not really motivated by this whole idea of change?
Yeah, you know, I don't, you know, there's not much difference between growing up in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. I mean, you know, the landscape looked pretty much the same. The jobs that you could do remained pretty much the same. There wasn't much difference. No, you know, the book has a very specific focus, which is that, you know, the economy changes, and that I take it as a given that it's a liberating force, you know. So I think these were stories of change for me, you know, these were positive stories. These were the kids who reaped the benefits of liberalization. This was the first crop of that generation. And for me, there was so much positive change in what they were doing and the lives they were leading that, you know, the other stuff wasn't that important. And also, because the economy was doing well, I don't think that politics was so important to this generation, you know. I see myself, or when I was writing the book, I saw myself as an embedded journalist in Young India, in the convoy of Young India, and the idea was just to be there and just to, you know, keep my ears and eyes open. And I didn't use a dictaphone. I would blend into people's lives, and they would let me do that, you know. So I would spend time with them and then come away with a story, and which was an inside story. Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit on this?
You know, when you write non-fiction, you don't have to fill it with facts and statistics, and you don't have to make it bad journalism. You can write it as excellent fiction, and that's why the subtitle of the book is A Personal Journey. So it's as much about me as it's about my generation.
Somewhere you've mentioned that Indian writers are trapped in some sort of a contrived, artificial, intellectual space.
I mean, just the themes that a lot of Indian fiction novelists write about, I find, you know, I mean, they're very academic themes, you know. I mean, you're writing about immigration and identity and exile and, you know, I mean, caste and, you know, which kind of, you know, there must be other things to write about, which is why I find Indian fiction slightly, or there are family dramas, you know, but there's not much happening apart from that.